Welcome to One Bottle and Three Questions with myself, Mike Best, Nelson Parry, and we are joined today by John Atkinson, Master of Wine, from Danbury Ridge, to talk about the 2022 Octagon Block Chardonnay. John, we're going to kick off right away with question number one about the history of Essex. So, for the listeners who don't know about the counties of England, you could give a background into Essex and also explain kind of where England is up to in its quest for regionality. That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, Essex. I mean, you've got to address the I suppose there's an elephant in the county. Everybody's written an article on us. I think has always begun with the only way is Essex, the only wine is Essex, or the joy of Essex. But you guys are probably a little bit too young to remember that book. But yeah, Essex is east of London. It's a really interesting county. It's got a bit of a rap. It's got a bit of a sort of reputation for being loud, libidinal, ostentatious. But there are many parts of Essex. If I told you what 30% of Essex was, or 30% of the country's salt marshes were in Essex, there's places like Saffron Walden, Danbury, really pretty, loose and sort of woodsy. But there's historically, I think there was a law in London that said you couldn't have any heavy industry west of the River Lee, so very much the eastern side of London. So industry established there, lots of jobs, lots of people went to make their fortune, and as they did so, they kind of drifted east into the Cockney countryside, the Cockney seaside, as it became Southend-on-Sea, and that effectively became a conurbation. Now, the vine doesn't discriminate socially, so we have vines in all those areas. We've got vines overlooking Southend-on-Sea, would you believe? We have some in Danbury, which is that sort of very sort of pretty part, and we've got some vineyards on the Dengie Peninsula, which nobody has ever heard of. I always admire Essex people. They've got that sort of go-gettedness. I always say it's a bit like Texas. Well, if that kind of conurbation to the south is like Texas, then the Dengie is the sort of flyover state. It's kind of remote, windswept. There aren't many people living there, and we all tell the joke about people with three eyes and 5 or 4 toes or whatever. But we cover all that area. It's got a history of winemaking that does extend back, but it was rather hidden by people making wine. It used to sell grapes, still does sell a lot of grapes into people, into producers in Kent and in Sussex and elsewhere. And it was always thought to be very dependable in terms of achieving ripeness. But nobody was brave enough to put Essex on the label. It's like the wine world stopped at the Greenwich Meridian. And now, I think the interesting thing that Danbury did was we recognised that you could actually achieve real ripeness in still wine grapes. And therefore, if you actually went at this properly, as we said, you took a workhorse and turned it into a thoroughbred, you might be able to end up with something that was drinkable. But still, absolutely enormous risk, because this was unproven. There was a little bit of, I remember there was a little bit of Pinot Noir being sold out of the county historically, and that was being pressed as a Blanc de Noir and mixed with Bacchus, and that was the only evidence we had, that we could produce something really, or there was potential to produce good still wines. So, the Bunker family who owned Danbury, they were excited at the prospect of putting in a vineyard. They kind of went in at a reasonably sort of manageable scale. I think the first vineyards were about 30 acres, 35 acres. But they put a winery in. And I think wherever you are in the world, I think when you're making still wine particularly, but at 51 degrees north, you need that connectedness throughout the whole process. Yeah, you need to be looking after the vines, pruning them, doing all those sort of things we do by hand, leaf removal, trimming, etc., etc. You need to be on top of that because, what anybody will tell you about viticulture is it is really, really time sensitive. And if you fall behind, not only does the quality fall, but you never catch up. So the issue, I think, as I see it with making still wine in the UK is that separation between people who grow grapes and people who make wine. And the first time you come across those grapes as a winemaker is when they arrive at the cellar door. I think there's more forgiveness and in that method if you're actually doing it somewhere warm. But 51 degrees north, I'm afraid you haven't really got a hope. So that connectedness has always been really, really important, and it's become more so actually as we've gone along. So that now we have a sort of team of 5 or 6 full-time people that, unfortunately for them, in the winter they get kicked out into the to do the pruning, and in the summer when it's nice and warm outside, we drag them in to do the bottling and all the work there. So I'm not selling the job, but there seem to be lots of people who want to come along and do it. So there you go.
The established names of English wine sort of from the sort of 90s onwards have been based around Sussex and Kent. And so what was it that led the founders to believe that this could create something, not just, as you say, a workhorse, but a thoroughbred? What is it that really led you to believing that this could be world class?
Well, I think, if I'm honest with you, Mike, with hindsight, it's all planned. They had that normally regretted visit by somebody who was loosely connected with the wine business, who wanted. They had some fields next to where they lived, and this friend sort of wandered around and said, "Have you ever considered putting a vineyard in there?" I mean, normally I'd say, 999 times out of 1,000, that would be the end of the friendship. And you'd probably, if you planted the vineyard and went ahead with it, and the whole thing failed, you would hunt out that friend and go and thump them in the face. But it worked. They were really lucky to have the land sort of divided into 3 different plots, even though they're adjacent. I always say about Essex that it's fairly uneventful and flat countryside. But side by side, you had a deep gravel vineyard. The area wasn't glaciated, but it was at the end of the ice sheet, and sand and gravel accumulated. We had a kind of mixed vineyard, a bit of sand and gravel, a bit of clay that changes across the kind of 10 acres or so. That's the Octagon, the one we'll taste. And there's also a vineyard called the Slipnir, and that is London clay. So you had 3 things very different from each other. And originally I think we thought, the gravel, great, because we all know we all know Bordeaux has gravel and it does a really good job with it. And we were slightly worried about the clay. Well, the clay really then subsequently came to its own. But yeah, there was an awful lot of risk attached to it because the winery was sort of commissioned early on. It was like Liam, who's the winemaker, had made one wine from those grapes down at Lime Bay Winery. It was the best fruit he'd ever seen, and he reported back to the bunkers and made the wine. And on the basis of having tasted one wine made in 2016, they went ahead and put in a 120,000 bottle capacity winery. So yeah, it jumped in big, but it could have all gone terribly wrong. But yeah, they lucked out. Mike Bunker, who owns it, will always tell you he's the luckiest man in the world. Well, yeah, so stay near these lucky people is what I say.
Don't want to drift too far away from the questions, but anyway, I thought it's relevant that this wine, which for wine in general, this is a ripe, bright style of Chardonnay that fits into, I'm sure it's fooled lots of people and will do more in the future. You could say this is from Tasmania, or this is from Marlborough, or this is from Oregon, or so, people are gonna confuse these wines in blind tastings, or indeed Burgundy. And apart from the site, are there other things in the vineyard that you think have really made the difference in terms of being able to get that ripeness and that brightness and that quality?
Yeah, I think I always look at this like a sort of radar graph, where on every axis, you have to be pushed out right to the limit, and you kind of measure the space that's enclosed by the graph, and there are real advantages there. I mean, and it changes. The climate changes. I do say climate quite quickly, even when you go compare it with London. So the areas interpenetrated, the kind of land and sea interpenetrate each other in a series of estuaries. So we have the Blackwater, the Crouch, the Roach, and of course the biggest of all, the Thames estuary. Now the effect of those intrusions of water, of seawater, tidal water, is to limit convection, because if you shine the sun on the land all day long, the land heats up, air rises, and you get cloud. I mean, we're all familiar with fair weather cloud in this country. You kind of think it bubbles up at 11 o'clock. Now that doesn't happen in Essex or it's limited in Essex because of these estuaries, or this part of Essex. So that's really interesting. So sunshine hours are elevated from 1600 to 1850 hours. So that helps. We're not light limited, particularly, and that compares really well with Dijon. That sort of 48th parallel in France, Colmar, whatever. Very similar sunshine hours. The other is rainfall. The convection element means, or the reduced convection tends to mean we don't get that many storms. And particularly as you move to the kind of extremes of estuarine Essex, and you always get to the Thames estuary, the 10-year average on rainfall is 475 millimetres. I mean, that is astonishingly low. It always used to be you need 600 millimetres to grow grapes. So you can see, look, we don't have the evapotranspiration rates of Bordeaux, whatever, but you can see it's pretty marginal for grape growing, and it does allow us to get stress into the vines. Holds temperature pretty well. I mean, we are, for those people who know growing degree days, the sites across the region are first vineyards, probably about 1,000 growing degree days, but we are already, we've got some new sites coming up, which are about 1,120 growing degree days. Well, that's the historic value for Dijon in the 80s. So sunshine levels good. The rainfall is low and manageable, and growing degree days, heat summation are pretty much where I say Dijon was in the past. So that the only other bit you then got to add in is see how the soil is impacting that as well. Because one of the warnings I always have for anybody that just wants to look at climatic data is, if you look at the whole of Burgundy, it kind of shares a climate. It's a mesoclimate, and within it you have sweet spots, and they're called Haut-Malcanceau, Le Chambertin, Romani-Conti. It's not just about climate. I think there's almost a sort of belief at the moment that if you throw 10,000 vines in your pony paddock, you might have Romani-Conti next week. I'm afraid that isn't going to happen. And really, part of my job is to kind of try and get ahead of that curve and identify, where the good sites are. So yeah.
So John, as a second question, you just introduced the discussion on site selection, which we would love to talk more about it. And especially, I cannot tell you how many times I've read your article, the Clay on Tim Atkin's website. So I think it will be interesting for those who haven't read the article, if you can delve down also into Essex geology and then come back also onto site selection.
If you look at Essex, it's fairly uneventful countryside, but actually quite interesting for viticulture. I think that probably has, again, probably put people off a bit. There's nothing like seeing a hillside of chalk, to think, oh, we can plant grapes here. And I think most people's trigger for planting a vineyard is south facing. Well, quite honestly, I don't care which way it faces. Our light levels are pretty good. As long as there's some kind of slope orientation to help drainage, I'm comfortable with that. I'd say that looking at Burgundy and Bordeaux and looking across to France more generally, vineyard land is hierarchized space. It's graded for quality, and we know Grand Cru, Premier Cru, Village, generic. And I was really interested to see in this sort of rather monotonous countryside whether there were differences. Now, we'd imagined it was all going to be about sand and gravel, stressing the vine, warm soils, bringing everything up to ripeness. What the real surprise came in 2019 and 2020, particularly 2020. For all that climatic data I gave you, I mean, Mark Twain famously said, "Climate's what we expect, weather's what we get." And in September of 2020, having had a good year, suddenly it was like, I think it was the 27th of September, the seal broke, and it just rained and it rained and it rained, and we're about a month away from harvest, and we're getting very kind of concerned. And normally, what happens when you get rain, with a month to go, you're looking at sugars and acids on a Thursday, looking at the game on a Monday. There was one instance where we had 100 millimeters of rain on the Saturday, and dear old Liam couldn't be coaxed out of his house to go and measure anything. Anyway, we did it, and we found, particularly it was on the clay vineyards, that not only had there been no swelling, but sugars had gone up. And we just thought, what the hell's going on here? I'd written a few things in the past. Mike, you'll get this. I mean, I think when you do the MW, sometimes you kind of get to the other side and think, how did I do that? And I wanted to kind of understand things a bit more deeply and just sort them out in my own thinking. And I wrote a couple of articles on hydrology and Burgundy. I think there were 3 pieces. I think they were published in the Journal of Wine Research, probably only read by the people looking at the papers. The reviewers, the reviewers are the only people that suffered them. But it was obvious how hydrology was, a deficit, or maintaining a deficit in the vineyard for the vine was beneficial in terms of grape size, but also it accelerated maturity and it allocated carbohydrate towards the fruit. Well, clearly this was happening with the London clay. When we looked at it, and I'd done a bit of work on Bordeaux as well, and I remember smectite. I remember smectite from Petrus, So I just did that kind of Google search. I'm not a geologist, I did the Google search. I said, okay, smectite London clay. Lo and behold, comes back, yeah, it's a smectited clay, or its illitized place is smectited. And that smectite really adds to this shrink swell capacity of the clay. When I moved to London bought a flat in London in 1995 or whatever, when people could afford flats, the first thing everyone ended up doing was, getting their houses underpinned because the bloody clay was shrinking underneath. Well, at the extreme of shrink swell, or the area that's most prone to it, is this very eastern part of Essex. And there, I eventually wrote something with the British Geological Survey on clay activity, but it's incredibly beneficial for the vine if it's dry, as it was in 2022, the clay cracks at depth and the rootlets can get going and extract water. If it rains, it just seals at the surface, it expands, so the water can't get in. So it's almost like the roots are dealing with the climatic regime rather than the weather. And year after year, I mean, it's just so consistent. And the other bit, and this kind of goes to the personality of some of the wines, the cation exchange capacity, by which we mean how the nutrients or the quantity of nutrients that are held in the soil is really high. So what you get is this combination of very limited water supply, but a lot of nutrients. And I think that really adds to the aroma and the character and personality of the wine. So as a result, I set about trying to find, well, what is the most, is there somewhere that's really, really heavily smectited in this area? And we did find it. The frustration is, well, how do we get it? It belongs to a farmer. Farmers at that point, they weren't paying inheritance tax, so they weren't selling anything. But it took 2 goes, and we got it, and we planted it. And I think that will be a really, really interesting special vineyard. And we've got another one coming as well, which is sand and gravel over blue smectited clay, and that I think will going to be good. It's more Chardonnay, because we're talking about Chardonnay. Chardonnay is probably better at coping with drought than Pinot Noir. This sort of isohydric, anisohydric behaviour they have. So I think Chardonnay is definitely more forgiving in the crouch, but Pinot, very inelastic, as we all know, very kind of fussy.
So the thing with the smectite clay has this sort of magical property of being able to perform well in both dry and wet years. This is an advantage, particularly for Essex, in being in England.
Absolutely, and I think you've got to be careful not to universalise these properties, because obviously it works under conditions where there's, for us, fairly limited rainfall, quite limited evapotranspiration. And if we make the comparison with Bordeaux has probably about 40-50% more rainfall than we do. Perhaps not in the growing season, still has a bit more. But the evapotranspiration rates there are probably about 30% higher. So you can kind of equalise them and kind of say, well, yeah, it means we can kind of look at Bordeaux not as a model, but as something that gives us a sort of bit of a heads up as to what's likely to happen. And it has, it's worked really, really well. We're not planting Cabernet Franc, or Merlot. We don't. 1,800 hours of sunshine's good, but I think we probably need we need the earth to shift closer to the sun, I think, to enable ripening those.
Every time we think about clay as a soil, we always come down, to red varietals mainly. It's more rare in the worldwide to hear the amazing white wines made out of a majority clay soil. More of a rarity also to market them. So was that a concern for you guys? We need to check how much, if there's 10% limestone in the soil, or how did you work that out?
Yeah, well, we don't really have any limestone in the soil. These are the London clay is 50 million years old. It really comes from a time where the only land, or the only recognisable bit of the UK above water was sort of the West Country, Scotland, Wales, and there was a lagoon, and to the south of that lagoon was Brittany. And it was the erosion of those 2 elements coupled with volcanic ash, because this was done at the Epresian period when there was a lot of volcanicity and a lot of water splashing around, hence the hydrolysis of those minerals down into clay. I did a discussion group with Kees van Leeuwen, a professor at Bordeaux University. He'd been at Cheval Blanc, and Cheval Blanc, he famously instructed them to pull the vines out the gravel, sand and gravel, and go to the clay. And he was quite revealing. He was surprised that we got this clay when I presented it. That was my part of the panel discussion. And he said something very interesting. He said, everyone thinks of Petrus, because they always talk about this blue clay. And maybe Gazin has a little bit and whatever. And he said, well, it is rare, but it's under Cheval Blanc. it's under Latour, and it's under Dickem. And he said, it is transcendent. Wherever you come across this particular clay, it is really, really good for whatever you want to do. And I think we've kind of, we've seen it. I mean, it's not to say, I mean, the gravel vineyards can be really interesting as well, and we've got gravel over clay, but this buffering capacity of the soil, particularly where we are now climatically, because we're, we have the warmest year on record in 2022, and the vineyard gets to 41.5 degrees, and the previous year before that, we were 2 degrees below normal in July and August. So it's extraordinary how we achieved ripeness, particularly in 21, given a lot of people couldn't even make sparkling wine. Yet we got to 13.5 potential, but we were picking on the 10th of November. So,
Well, that's the other advantage of the climate, though. I mean, if you've not got botrytis in 21, then it's in November. That's the advantage of the
climate. And botrytis is less of a problem for us because by the time you get into October, by the time you get into November, it's not very warm. So it's always in France. France is a lot of the vineyards continental climate. They reach sugar ripeness much earlier in the year, and they get that combination of heat and light, or particularly heat and rain, and then rot sets in. I was in Champagne in 2017. It was the grapes were ripe, and we had 3 or 4 days where it was tropical. It was 32, 33 degrees, raining, and it was dropping to 28 degrees at night. And that just completely wrote off the 2017 harvest, particularly when 2018 came along, and everyone could say, "Oh, yeah, we all declassified, we would send all our wine to the distillery." God, there was some nervous times if 2018 hadn't been any good,
So question 3, we do try and keep these questions concise, but I fear this is not going to happen. We're going to go a bit freestyle on this, but we wanted to ask you about breaking the Chardonnay playbook. And you've said some very interesting things about where the idea of the marketing wines, how you do the winemaking builds into that. We wanted to try and focus on some specifics of the wine, but maybe just take us through the key elements of the style that impact the key elements that impact the style of this wine, and why that is done that way when you have a lot of different options.
As I said, I think this is the point where you start playing Burgundy bingo, and there are a couple of things that everyone wants to say. If it's Pinot Noir, well, it's whole bunch. We use this Cooper, Mallow's delayed. We do this with Mallow, whatever it is, And it, as I say, I think grape varieties come with a manual, and that manual's often written in France over the centuries, and you kind of feel like you've got to fall in line with it. And there's good reason, they've had a lot of practice, they know what they're doing. But it extends a bit further than that. I mean, I kind of rather glossed over your marketing question last time, but I always say, if it's Cabernet Sauvignon, you kind of sell it on the vintage, and because Bordeaux is all about vintage. And if it's the Burgundian grape varieties, if it's Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, you kind of, in the manual it says it's all about individual vineyard sites. So, that being said, I think we've been very cautious about identifying certain qualities. I think some people just throw in Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, and the separation of the vineyards can be very small, but they just feel like, we better call them this, and we'll sell them as separate wines. I think it's really important to remember that unlike Bordeaux, with Burgundy, you're just dealing with one grape variety. You're dealing with Pinot, or when you make the wine, there's no blending. You've got Pinot Noir, you've got Chardonnay, and you have to get some complexity into that wine. Now, the way we've achieved that is, yes, blending a bit between sites, and barrel fermenting everything. in every barrel is its own sort of ecosystem. Now we cannot. I think Chardonnay is a very simple, frictionless process. We use a coquard press, which is a champagne press. So that would be pretty unique to us. Most people use a horizontal press, and we've had the Burgundians visiting, and they're actually quite jealous of the coquard press, because you can get a lot of. We can probably recover 67% of the masses juice without absolutely smashing it up and without extracting green characters. I think that becomes quite difficult with a horizontal press. And we do make a sparkling wine, so there is a reason. But this will amuse you. They've all said to us when they come and they look around, they kind of look at it and they kind of do that sucking through their teeth, and they say, "Oh, we can't afford equipment like that." You say, "What?" Also, because of the scale of production, you can put quite a bit in a coquard press, whereas if you've got 4 rows of Chardonnay or whatever, you can't fill it. So we just direct press. There's not really that much settling. You get quite a lot of solids, but they're kind of good solids into barrel. The barrels aren't filled up, 160, 165 litres. Ferment kicks off. I would say sometimes we do again, Burgundy Bingo, wild fermentations. I don't know how legitimate that is, because once you've used a Prix de Mousse yeast in the winery, it's so bloody strong and dominant and neutral. I've got to say, it's not really doing work for you other than fermenting the sugar. That may well be certainly the yeast that will finish off the ferment. Depending on the year, we don't heat up the winery. It's a clever it's a clever design. It's insulated, so it gets to about 17, 18 degrees in the summer, 9 degrees in the winter. So a bit like a Bordeaux cellar, but clearly no chemistry happens, below about 10 degrees. So you have a period of things being really inert. So 21 was interesting because we did the ferments in barrel, and they just didn't want to go through malolactic. Bear in mind that English wines have fairly low pHs anyway. So you can't add sulfur. So just leaving them over the winter. And again, this is probably where you do get some parallel with Burgundy. What we found is the Chardonnay was pretty grim. By the time we got through to spring, it was aldehydic. What were you going to do? We don't have the distillers that they have in France. So it should be on speed dial. Anyway, so temperature comes up, malolactic begins, and the wine was just fabulous. So it kind of cleaned itself up. So now what we do is deliberately chuck open all the doors, and try and get the wine as cold as possible. And some of it will go through mallow, some of it won't. But it does seem to produce a fairly complex wine. And I think in terms of lees, I think one of the consequences, and this is I see as a benefit for Chardonnay, not only do you have the grape skins, the yeast, because malic levels are quite high, you have quite a lot of lactic lees. And I think actually in white wine, they're probably more beneficial than they are in red wine, in Pinot Noir. But they kind of, we get quite heavy lees, reasonable levels of reduction. Do we stir and agitate the lees? We started doing that in 2020, but we only do it once, just before it goes into stainless steel. So, and then it gets settled out over about a 6-month period. And it brings a bit of reduction, and it gets us away slightly from the wine being really, really primary. And, because these wines, they wouldn't taste them, we'll say, they taste riper than Burgundy, you've got more character. So you need to subdue that a little bit. I think sometimes when we've just bottled, they can be a bit almost too intense. So
I think that is something that people, haven't tried many English still wines, wouldn't necessarily know, that they actually can be quite aromatic and fruit forward, which is sort of surprising in some sense. But they have a lot of bright orchard fruit in good years. So yeah, I totally get the point.
Yeah, but they also have, and I think this again is important if we're talking about, I don't want to say terroir, but I mean they do have a character that repeats every year. So, in all the wines, we seem to get this orange blossom, clementine elements of the acids that really pulls through in the finish. And if you're going to make a comparison, they're not like Chablis. They're more like Côte d'Or, but they've got some of the vitality of Jour as well. I mean, I don't be reductive, but that you can kind of see it, and they can be, in that sense, really persuasive. The Octagon is a barrel selection, and so and it does come from the Octagon vineyard, which is is a mix. It's got clay, it's got sandy clay. There's a little bit of gravel as well. It's always quite slow to ripen. Low vigor, I'd say now. At the start, we thought we got high vigor, then we sort of worked against that. And we thought we got low vigor. I mean, you can never quite get the vigor of the vineyards where you want it, but it crops at a fairly low level. I think probably in this year maybe about 1.5 tons an acre. But it importantly goes through the magical second winter in barrel. So I think at that point, even though this has quite a lot of new oak, I mean this is 55% probably new oak, nice coopers, Chassin, Rousseau, a bit of Francois Frère. I mean, all the brands, but the effect of new oak diminishes and the effect of the lees increases, particularly with that second year. So, if you compared it to the estate wine is has that real sort of opulence, that brightness. It jumps out of the glass. And if you're a new wine region, a wine has to perform. You've got to persuade people that they've got to notice something about it. They go, wow, bloody hell, what's this? Whereas this is more an attempt to make, again, a more somber, I guess, sort of, it's that sort of Burgundian style. We are occupying their intellectual property. We're jumping into their barrels using their coopers, and I say it comes with the manual that they've developed, and we follow it.
Today's episode, we were very fortunate to be joined by John Atkinson from Danbury Ridge, and the wine that we were tasting was the 2022 Danbury Ridge Octagon Block Chardonnay, of which 2,948 bottles were produced, so limited production. And the three questions were around the history of Essex in winemaking, the clay soils and their impact on the wines, and the third question was around how to break the Chardonnay playbook. John, thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.